This lesson will take us to the end of the Soviet Union. When we last left off, Stalin had died of stroke, and Khrushchev took over. Now, with Khrushchev, he attacks Stalin's cult of personality, this image of Stalin being, oh, so great. No Soviet leader would ever have the level of complete control that Stalin had. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, that's saying, oh, Stalin's actually a criminal, included changes in foreign and domestic policy, especially regarding agriculture. That's farming. Criticism of his performance in these areas led to his removal in 1964. Khrushchev gets kicked out. He was replaced by Alexei Kozygin and then Brezhnev. Brezhnev led the USSR until his death in 1982, when he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov. Andropov was elected. He served 2 years, and then Chernenko was elected, and he served for 2 years. Now, the problem with these two, Andropov and Chernenko, they're very old. They're two aging, long-time party members. And with failing health, they had to end their career right when it began. And up steps Gorbachev as the last Soviet leader. The USSR had survived World War I, a civil war, World War II, including tens of millions of deaths resulted from those wars. They had also persevered through repression and terror, forced labor, execution, and famine. However, by 1980s, the world was changing, and the Soviet Union's satellite states were discontented. The Soviet Union had achieved extraordinary success in industrializing and modernizing its society throughout the 20th century. However, in the final analysis, communism could not provide its citizens with the same quality and quantity of consumer goods that the same degree of freedom enjoyed in other world societies, like the United States. In 1985, Soviet politicians turned to a younger man to lead the nation, Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev. Know who Mikhail Gorbachev was? Last Soviet leader. While he had served the party for 30 years, he had come of age in the decades during and after Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. A trained attorney, he had traveled in the West and was well aware of the fact that the Soviet Union lagged far behind capitalist nations in economic development and social satisfaction. Gorbachev quickly implemented two new concepts that we need to know about: Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost and Perestroika. Well, Glasnost means openness, Perestroika means restructuring. Well, since the time of Lenin, the Soviet Union had veered away from classic Marxist theory. By giving the Communist Party and not the workers almost complete control of production and industry. Instead of the workers in charge, it was the government. While the Soviet Union made extraordinary advances, by the 1980s it had become clear that the nation was beginning to founder under the burden of significant social and economic problems. By lifting the veil of secrecy that shrouded the Soviet Union, Gorbachev invited public discussion about the nature of social problems. He initiated the process of addressing these issues in order to make positive changes in Soviet society. Perestroika offered the promise of increasing worker motivation and making economic and productive decisions more efficient. We need to be a better country. How should we do it? Tell me, please. Oh, but we have some growing troubles. December 1970, 3,000 Polish workers assembled in a Polish shipyard to protest price increases. Over the course of the next several years, a workers' movement would strengthen in its opposition to the communist regime in Poland. Protesters sought more and better food, more favorable prices and wage increases. In 1980, Lech Walesa emerged as its leader of the workers' movement, which became known as Solidarity. Lech Walesa would go on to become the first non communist president of Poland and leader of his Solidarity Party. Very important figure. He demanded wage increases, trade unions, and the release of political prisoners. Protests in Germany began in the spring of 1989 over the question of accurate vote counts in the national elections. They escalated over the summer as thousands of East Germans fled to the West by traveling through Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Thousands more protested at home for reform. When the Soviet Union chose not to intervene, a new era in Soviet satellite relations was initiated. Remember, but before, East Germany had rioted before, the Soviets had sent the tanks. But under Gorbachev, under Glasnost and Perestroika, they would not send in the tanks this time. The opening of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, marked the beginning of the end of communism in Europe and the USSR. It also signaled the beginning of German reunification. Remember East and West Germany? Well, after 1989, we start to see the possibility of a single unified Germany that we have today. 1990 to 91. Well, Gorbachev gave little formal regard to Marxism or Lenin theory or communism. His reforms fractured the one party state, the state's economic monopoly, and the history of terror and repression in the USSR history. In a speech in February 1990, Gorbachev advocated the spiritual and political liberation of the USSR. He effected the transition to multi party rule for the first time in 70 years. For the first time in most people's lifetimes, there was a choice in who to vote for. Yet, his reforms could not address the growing troubles confronting the USSR. Industry and commerce verged on collapse. Retail trade had declined significantly. Grain imports and the imports of consumer goods had increased, and inflation ran rampant. The USSR was beginning to crumble. The satellite countries like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia soon declared independence from the USSR. A word to the people. This letter, signed by leading public figures, including army generals, the first deputy minister of foreign affairs, and prominent writers, was published in the summer of 1991. Let's try to figure out what mood does the author convey. An enormous, unprecedented misfortune has occurred. The motherland, our country, is perishing, is being broken up, is being plunged into darkness and oblivion. Well, the mood here is pessimism, deep pessimism. It's not looking good for the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, despite publication of desperate public sentiments such as this, Gorbachev, his wife, his daughters, son in law, and grandchildren made plans to vacation on the Black Sea in August that year. Didn't really bother him. 91. Well, on August 18th, Gorbachev's vacation was interrupted by an attempted coup. Plans were made in Moscow to create a state committee for the emergency situation. However, the members of the committee failed to appear for a planned press conference. Army tanks sent into the street of Moscow were stopped by civilians who asked the young soldiers manning them how they could use force against their own citizens. By August 21st, the bumbling state committee had effected only a news blackout of its own decisions. On August 22nd, Gorbachev returned to Moscow and retook limited control as Boris Yeltsin began to assert his own power. Boris Yeltsin would be the first president of the new independent Russia after the Soviet Union. So, as president of Russia and chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, Yeltsin refused Gorbachev's request to reorganize the USSR as a union of sovereign states. On December 1st, the Ukraine voted for independence, sounding the death knell for any union. By the end of the month, Gorbachev had stepped down and the USSR had been disbanded on Christmas Day. Perestroika. These quotations are from letters received by Louis Fisher, author of Survival in Russia, Chaos, Hope in Everyday Life. They reflect the immediate crisis after the dissolution of the USSR and the lack of everyday necessities such as food. As the USSR collapsed, the institutional structures and routines that sustained daily life collapsed too. This was only the beginning of the troubles Russia would face in the post Soviet years. Can you imagine? You lived your whole life, you got the free childcare and the free gym membership and free vacations, and you had your job, and now all of a sudden it's gone. No Social Security anymore. All right, problems. Problems. You can imagine when the government falls apart, there's going to be some problems. The post-socialist transition was rife with struggle and difficulty. Between 1992 and 1994, inflation ran as high as 800%. Prices soared. Markets for Russian products shrank as the people of Central and Eastern Europe increased their purchase of Western European and American goods. The loss of markets and the breakdown of internal economic institutions in the former USSR caused factories to shut down, forcing tens of thousands of people out of work. Doctors were fired because the state could no longer afford to pay their salaries. The cost of healthcare and medicine skyrocketed. Stricken with despair, the people of the former USSR became more vulnerable to addictions to alcohol or other drugs. Ethnic nationalities within Russia, such as the Chechens, initiated struggles for independence, but were suppressed violently by the Russian army. The Chechens are still fighting for independence, and many others within the Russian sphere of influence. Fatalism. Here's a quote. What communism instilled in us was this absence of a future, the absence of a dream, of the possibility of imagining our lives differently. There was hardly a way to say to yourself, this is just temporary, it'll pass, it must. On the contrary, we learn to think this will go on forever, no matter what we do. So, fatalism is the belief or attitude that the future is fixed and humans are powerless to affect change. How does this author's remarks express this fatalistic point of view? Well, she writes about the absence of a future, the absence of a dream. She expresses her belief that communism would last forever. Nothing you can do. Very fatalist. By the time the USSR collapsed, many people there and in many of the former Soviet states held fatalistic outlooks on life. As a result, millions of people truly struggled with the transition to a free society and a market economy. They couldn't handle change. They didn't consider change a possibility before. Mixed blessings of freedom. And this will be our final slide before your Google form questions. Freedom often is a mixed blessing. In Russia, as in other Soviet and Soviet bloc countries, the end of communist rule brought unprecedented opportunities. For the first time in decades, people could gather freely, speak their minds openly, criticize the government without fear of reprisal, publish oppositional media, and engage in other activities. Americans take for granted religious institutions and all other things in our life that's about free expression. Now, Russia had a blossoming of these things. Thousands of Jews chose to immigrate to Israel and the United States. Economic restructuring of the Russian economy offered lucrative business opportunities to those Russians savvy enough to sufficiently well prepared to take advantage of them. However, others plummeted into poverty. Alcoholism, HIV infection, tuberculosis are just some of the significant health problems affecting Russia today. Russia faces a declining population with annual births of approximately 9 per 1,000 people, while deaths hover close to 15 per 1,000 people. 20th century industrialization has also had significant environmental costs. Air pollution, agricultural pollution, deforestation, soil erosion, groundwater contamination, radioactive contamination all pose significant problems in Russia today. Periodic violence in the North Caucasus region threatens to destabilize Russian politics. Only time can tell what the future holds for Russia. Here are the discussion questions. What are the key ideas between Glasnost and Perestroika? How were they meant to save Soviet communism? And why do you think the crisis for the Soviet Union began in the nations it was controlling?